No, I'm really happy. I hope that folks watching this feel a sense of community with the other people watching this, because I think it's a small percentage of the world who happen to be wired this way, who happen to be interested in these questions, but they're really lovely questions.
Yeah. So, welcome Dr. Jay Michaelson to Seekers of Unity. It's a pleasure having you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I totally enjoyed doing my homework for today by watching other episodes.
Oh, nice. I'd be curious to know which episode you watched and what you enjoyed of them, because we're always looking for great feedback. In today's conversation, we hope to talk about mysticism today, the insights of mysticism within a context of healthy skepticism, modern science and psychology, and our crazy internet age and contemporary life. And I think there's really no one better to be talking about that than with you, Dr. Michaelson. And I'd like to introduce you to our audience with a joke. I wonder if this has been done before, because I know you've been introduced 1,000 times, but this is the joke. A lawyer, a rabbi, a meditation teacher, you know where this is going, an LGBT rights activist, all walk into a bar. He then orders a drink, and his name is Dr. Jay Michaelson. Besides for all of the above, Jay is a columnist for The Daily Beast and the editor at 10% Happier, a meditation platform. He's a frequent contributor on NPR, MSNBC, CNN, The Atlantic, Washington Post, The Forward, and others. The author of 8 fantastic books and over 300 articles on religion, sexuality, law, and contemplative practice. He's written on sadness and the spiritual path, American Buddhism, God vs. Gay, non-dual Judaism, and embodied spirituality. Your books are really a very, very full spectrum of the modern spiritual, contemplative, meditative, mystical life, and they're very, very great to read. I think my first read of yours was Everything is God, your introduction to non-dual Judaism. Dr. Michaelson holds a PhD in Jewish thought, a law degree from Yale, and a non-denominational rabbinic ordination. He has taught at Harvard Divinity School, Yale University, Boston University Law School, and the Chicago Theological Seminary. He's the founder of Zeek, what I believe is the first online Jewish magazine, and the founder of not one but 2 LGBT rights organizations. He was also listed as in the Forward 50's most influential American Jews, and it's a pleasure to have you. And the reason why we wanted to have you on, besides for having read you, and I'm trying to get on all the people who I read and really enjoyed onto the podcast, it's just a fun way to talk to people who I've spent time with via their words. The reason is because I think you are a true living paradox. You're a real, what we would call a coincidente oppositorum. You're both, which is what we're really looking for here at Seekers of Unity. We're trying to unite the worlds here. You're tremendously accomplished. You're young, you're witty, you're switched on and plugged in. You're active on Twitter, and you're commenting all the time on the current affairs. And yet, you are very, very seriously engaged with not one, but a few ancient wisdom and mystical traditions in a way that most modern people would find very bizarre and arcane and strange, but perhaps that's changing. And I think you really embody a merger of contemporary living with ancient wisdom, and that is partly why you are here to join us.
Thank you. That was a way more coherent introduction than I could ever give of myself. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that was cool. So we hope to talk about mysticism today, as we said, the insights of mysticism within today's context of modern science, contemporary life. I added some things to the conversation topics besides what we went over in email, and I'm now going to spring them upon you, so it's going to be as much as a surprise for you as it is for the audience. And I want to add these, I think it's 6 or 7 things. It's what mysticism might teach us in 2021, your practice as an avid meditator, because I know that's something you've spent days and weeks and months doing, the falls and peaks of comparative mysticism, your work comparing the metaphysics of Kabbalah and Buddhism, spiritual materialism and immanentism, and getting beyond monism, the belief that everything is one. How are those things to add to the conversation?
So we're going to go a full 10 minutes to cover all of those.
It's going to be at least 10 minutes.
That's great. It's a wonderful break from, being in lockdown with my 3-year-old daughter. just to put all of those things in some real life perspective.
Yes. And to begin with real life perspective, I want to ask you to share a bit of your experience as a seeker, as a meditator, as an author and teacher, activist, communicator. How did you come to who you are today? Just a short even 5-10 minute description just to fill in the person who's sitting in front of us to the audience?
So certainly as like the introduction you gave, it's kind of trial and error. That's part of a subtitle of my new book, which is kind of a spiritual memoir, Enlightenment by Trial and Error. There was not and is not a plan. There maybe should have been one. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend planlessness as a life strategy. But I was always kind of a weird wannabe mystic, even as a little kid, going walking in nature. And I think part of that was just being an introvert and just being a little weird and maybe not fitting in with, the other kids. But that was very early, like as early as I have any, real memories. And I think that is often common for people who later do weird contemplative or mystical things. And that was certainly true for me. I've realized just in the past few years, as you mentioned, I work now in the sort of mindfulness world, which is really the other end. It's almost a coincidence that the same sets of practices can lead to mystical stuff and also just to stress reduction, let's say. And so it's been a reminder, actually, for me, working in the meditation business, so to speak, that my own initial interests, certainly, and even continuing, were more on the sort of mystical and contemplative sides. Throughout most of my 20s, I really just read about this stuff. I didn't do anything. I got very interested. I became what was called a nightstand Buddhist, which means I had Buddhist books on my night table, and that was it. And then in my junior year of college, roughly around there, I took a course in Jewish mysticism, the introduction to Jewish mysticism. What I didn't know at the time was that a lot of our sources were already filtered through 20th century mystics like Art Green, for example. I didn't until later kind of see the distinction between that and maybe the original source material. But I totally fell in love. And I had an experience that a lot of Jewish practitioners have. I then spent that year, I was in England that year, and then I spent a lot of time in Israel. I had a feeling of coming home to this material and to these traditions in a way that was really in my kishkas, to use the scientific term. I was raised just a sort of ordinary conservative Jew in the United States. Nothing interesting or weird about that, but there was some resonance with finding the mystical and contemplative material that I'd seen in other traditions in my Jewish tradition. And I became Baal Tshuva, and I lived in Israel for a few years, and even then was kind of dividing my time in a schizoid sort of way between the normal world and the weird world.
Can I just ask quickly, you said you became Baal Tshuva. Could you just translate into English?
Sure. I took on more traditional religious observance when I was 21, 22. I had been raised with like a little bit of keeping kosher and a little bit of observing the Sabbath, but then took on what looked like an Orthodox Jewish practice, which I kept for about 10 years. And I really felt it wasn't a matter of theology or belief at that point in my life. It was sort of the richness and the infusion in daily life of spirituality and community around that there were other crazy people doing this. And so whether it was maybe sitting around a Shabbat table and singing songs until late at night or more esoteric stuff, going up to Tzfat, the sort of mystical center in the north of Israel, and spending time there. Wherever it was on that spectrum of normalcy to weirdness, there were communities that were supportive. But I didn't really take up meditation practice or any contemplative practice personally seriously until I was 30. I should also say I studied Kabbalah. That's where I did my graduate work, was in Israel, and eventually got my PhD, as you mentioned, mostly in Jewish mysticism. I think there was a lot of reasons for that delay. I had a lot of stuff to figure out about myself, sexuality probably first and foremost, and also just who I was going to be in the world. But once I found meditation in a sort of serious way, it was in the Jewish Buddhist context. I really felt like I'd gotten the answer key to a lot of that Jewish observance and text. These sort of rapturous odes from the Psalms about being in love with the divine. It was good literature, but it wasn't more than that. But there was a sense on those first retreats. This was for me 2002, 3, 4, of really like, oh, this is what it means. Entering these kinds of concentrated mind states, whatever those are. Again, theologically and ontologically, I'm not so sure, but psychologically, that was possible to shift the mind or the brain and the mind-body system to really experience some of that radical amazement that I had read about and studied, and actually have some of the experiences that I'd puzzled over from a sort of philosophical point of view. I did a bunch of philosophy of religion, philosophy of mysticism work, again, in graduate school. And that was where I really launched onto where I am now. A lot of what I had held closely in the previous 10 years about my Jewish practice became a little more loose. For me, I think that was a positive development. For others, that might be seen very negatively. And sort of letting go of some of the practices and some of the beliefs and some of the structures that had really animated my life for the previous 10 years. Parenthetically, that's kind of what the book is about. Some part of the book is about that letting go. And all of that was leavened with a kind of earth-centered and body-centered spirituality. That was, again, connected to my coming out and to kind of unifying spirituality and sexuality in my own life, and figuring that out for myself in my own kind of trial and error sort of way. And gradually, I became much more serious about the Dharma, about Buddhist practice. So in 2004, I went on a 6-week retreat. 2008, 2009, I spent 5 months in silent meditation retreat, partly in Nepal, and really trying to kind of deepen that. And I would say these days, while I still have a sort of devotional Jewish practice that means a lot to me, and again, being a parent, it's just the simple stuff is really beautiful. Lighting candles on Friday night is really beautiful. It doesn't need to necessarily have a lot of theology around it, but just the experience, the ritual experience. Contemplatively, I'm probably wired mostly in a sort of Buddha Dharma perspective about what gets in our way and how to maybe let go of some of that. Al regel echad, on one foot. That's what I can say.
Thank you for sharing that personal story with us. It's always really great to begin with a personal story because it's a person that we're talking to after all, and that's what the beauty of the story is made up of. And that theme definitely of trial and error is definitely there throughout your work, where it seems like you're really just trying to figure it out yourself and trying to be as honest and authentic as we can with ourselves and make sense along the way. I want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, and something which I saw in your writings as well. You have this sort of joint journey between Jewish mysticism and Jewish Orthodox practice, and between Buddhist, the sort of Dharmic practice. And I saw that in one of your essays, you identified as a JuBu, and another one a Jewish Buddhist, and another one you identified as a BuJu, as a Buddhist Jew. And I'm curious to know if that switch is intentional, if there's a difference there between those two terms for you.
I love that. That's such a Jewishy, Talmudic-y sort of question. There is actually, I'm sorry to disappoint, there's actually no difference for me. I know for others there is. Some people, there's a wide spectrum of how these paths are integrated. There are some important Buddhists who happen to be Jewish. Joseph Goldstein is an example of that, one of the more important meditation teachers in the West. Has no real interest in his Jewishness. It's not ashamed of it. It's ethnically Jewish. His name's Joseph Goldstein, for heaven's sakes, but it doesn't play into his Dharma teaching really at all. And then there's some who are maybe primarily Buddhist, but who bring a lot of Jewishness in. So Sylvia Boorstein is an example of that. I might be a little lahavdil, but not putting myself on that level exactly, but that's some of my work as well. And then there are some folks who bring some Buddhist technologies maybe into the Jewish spirituality space, so mindfulness meditation, for example, but are conscious not to import the kind of overall worldview. So a lot of work for, let's say, for the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and some of the Jewish meditation world, which I am part of loosely. We're very aware that what we're bringing in is not an entire worldview necessarily, but picking and choosing pieces and hybridizing, just as Jews have always hybridized. Bagels and cream cheese were not indigenous Jewish cuisine either. Jewish music was not indigenous Jewish music. Jewish ritual forms were. So there's always been that process of cultural mixing. And so there's that wide range, but I don't know if I attach that to the word or the phrase, as I know others do.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating range of people, the way that they're blending those traditions, and I think that you have a very hot finger on the pulse of what's happening in that world, and that's very cool, even just to get a glimpse into that. I came across something that you wrote in a 2016 piece, and I know 2016 is a while ago, so you're entitled to disagree with what you said back then, but I think it ties nicely into this previous question, which is sort of the mystical path that one may choose between traditions. And in this case, it would be between, let's say, Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, which is the two traditions you've been straddling. And you wrote quite nicely that what you're interested in, like the Buddha was, is that you're interested in suffering and the cessation of suffering, and that a spiritual tradition that does not liberate one from the all too human tendencies towards greed, hatred, and delusion, you're just not interested in that. That you only have sort of one short lifetime in this world, and the rest of a tradition, if it doesn't achieve those things for the person, however Baroque it is you wrote, it just seems like decoration. And the title of that article, which I know you probably did not write the title, was probably an editor that wrote it, but the title was Why I Fell Out of Love with Kabbalah. And I thought that was a very interesting insight, because there's a variety of mystical traditions in the world, and they have their commonalities and differences. And I'm curious if you could shed some light on what you wrote back then in your feelings towards Buddhism as having an application to those effects, and Kabbalah as perhaps being decorative.
Yeah, so actually I did write that title, which is unusual. Yeah, I maybe wouldn't be quite as orthodox Buddhist right now as I was 5 years ago. I also wouldn't want to put anything on different levels as if there's some kind of objective measurement. So I wouldn't want to say that this is the real thing and this other thing is decoration, even if I did say that 5 years ago. I would just say they lead in different directions. I think, I don't think the central question of mainstream Judaism or of Kabbalah is why are we suffering and how can we suffer less? It's a question that gets asked, but it's usually asked in different forms. Why is there evil, for example? That's a little different from why are we suffering? It doesn't lead to a psychological set of psychological practices or answers like, oh, well, the reason you're suffering has to do with your mind, and here are some things to work on about your mind that will cause you to suffer a little bit less, or maybe 100% less if you're lucky, which I am not, just to be clear about that. But that's not, I don't think, the central question. For the Kabbalah, there are multiple questions depending on which stream of Kabbalah. One might be, how can I live a life where I'm in union with God a lot of the time? Not all the time, but some of the time, like Retzova show of running and returning. How can I have a life that's integrated into my community, but still has that mystical pursuit? Or how can I physically and spiritually maintain the cosmos? Because I understand that the cosmos is related to these ritual acts and these Kabbalistic intentions and so forth. Those are very different questions. And those are different from what I would say is a mainstream Jewish preoccupation, which is like, how do we all get along? How can we live a life where we're a bit more ethical to each other and where we have some relationship to whatever this God concept is? So those are just different questions. I think where I was going with that piece was a sense of frustration that there were people who clearly, and I won't name names, but some of the most famous Kabbalists, are active today, either, I don't know if it's either political or ethical, have positions that to me are just really problematic and really scary and dangerous. And then even on a sort of more mundane level, having taught Kabbalah in Jewish renewal context here in the United States for a while, it's just not, it becomes what Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi once called angel shit, taking over a Hasidic saying that all of the beauty of the world was just angel shit. He said that actually all of these sort of Baroque speculations and, moving parts and the Sefirot this and that and the other, it's just like, kind of, in my words, it was just like Dungeons and Dragons, right? I mean, it's an awesome game to play, but many times it's not connected to the things that I'm personally more interested in, which have to do with those questions about suffering. I mean, can I be a little less of a jerk to other people? Can I help make the world a better place in that way? And I don't have the sort of theological belief that it's the case that studying Torah keeps the land of Israel safe or something like that. So without that particular belief, I'm looking more pragmatically at what are the effects of these practices on people. But again, I think having said that, I'm probably more mystically interested than 95% of secular mindfulness meditators. And so I certainly don't want to put that down. I definitely think that there's a tremendous power in having amazing peak experiences, whether through meditation or through spirituality or prayer or psychedelics or in any other way. And we do only have one life. So, well, as far as I know, maybe we'll leave that question on the side. So yeah, these are some of the most beautiful experiences that it's possible to have in this life. So just because they don't necessarily make you suffer less in the long term, and that doesn't mean they're without value. And that that debate is present within all of the different traditions. The question of quietism, for example, in Hasidism was a major concern. So like, if everything is God, why bother observing the commandments? Why do the mitzvot? It doesn't make sense. If everything is holy, what are all these lines for and all these divisions? Or there's a famous Hindu teaching story where a meditation master goes into samadhi, which is means a lot of different things, but it usually is like a concentrated mind state. In this case, it was in the story, it's like a fully immersive trance. So he just kind of zones out. And so he's about to do it, and he's with his students around. He's like, I'm going to go into samadhi for 10 years. And right before he goes in, he's like, oh, I'm a little hungry. All right, never mind. I'll just go into samadhi. And then he goes into samadhi, he's in a trance. 10 years later, sure enough, he wakes up. The new set of students are around him, and he looks around. And he says, I'm kind of hungry. And the purpose of that teaching story is you can go into samadhi you can have this incredible exalted mystical experience, but your appetites will be the same, more or less, when you come back. I'm not. Yeah. So that's a teaching story. That's not necessarily me, but my view. But I have seen that. People go into have awesome states, but maybe aren't able to integrate them, or don't have the desire to integrate them. And you can have an incredible hechalot mystical vision while on ayahuasca, but if you come back and you're a schmuck, I'm not sure it's worth that much.
Yeah. That's definitely a very, very interesting point. I was listening to a panel this morning with Jeffrey Kripal, I think that's how his last name is pronounced. Kripal. And there was 3 other people. I don't remember their names because he was the only one who I read. And they were actually, the case you're making now is a case which you hear commonly in, I think it's a very healthy message that's being taught now in mystical and in spiritual and even in New Age circles, where just having your peak experiences can just turn you into a spiritual narcissist and can be part of your, ego trip or pleasure trip. But unless you're being a kinder, gentler, better person to your neighbor, to your mother-in-law, to your cat, then you may as well be not doing your spiritual, practices. And they were kind of rallying against that, saying that in some sense it may be reducing the mystical to the utilitarian. That unless there's some sort of positive benefit gain, which is not to say that mysticism without its practice is complete, but to see it simply as a matter of just its fruits or just its traits as opposed to states, from I think that's Houston Smith's language, is also missing, because mysticism is more than just about how it affects us in our everyday lives. It kind of, there's kind of this trend now in Silicon Valley where people will be microdosing an LSD to be crushing it better at their jobs that are destroying the planet. So there, do you think there's space for maybe for a bit of, this is a counterpoint which I'm usually never pushing, but do you think there's space to say there's a space for the mystical, qua mystical, as the purely ecstatic and aesthetic and beautiful, and it doesn't necessarily have to follow into something practical, real world application to still have value?
Definitely, yeah. I think it's kind of a to each their own sort of thing. It's a matter of what goals or what you're looking for. And sure, I mean, and again, it's not even just a matter of personal opinion. You could go back over the thousands of years. A good contemporary-ish example is the non-dual teacher Ramesh Balsekar, who was actually a banker in India for a while, had a very worldly life, had a number of profound openings, declared himself kind of an enlightened being, certainly had a tremendous amount of charisma. You can even get that on YouTube and his followers. And he engaged in a couple of things that maybe were not so ethical. And he said, who cares? If you think it's me, Ramesh, doing this, you haven't understood anything I've said, because everything is one, right? Brahman is Atman, everything is, there's no distinction between self and other. So he made a strong case, and I cited that, I think, in Everything is God, as a kind of putting a flag in the ground that's saying that conventional ethics not only is not important, but is actually just valueless. And that's a view. That leads to some troubling consequences, I think. It also, but even more moderately, again, some of those Jewish mystics who I decided not to name for Jewish prohibition against gossip reasons, make similar points. I mean, they're like, it doesn't matter how we treat some of these people, because there's something greater at stake. Heidegger said the same thing, by the way, about the Jews, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, this is the being coming into itself. Like, you don't have to worry about these little boring ethical things. So yeah, there's polls on both sides. Certainly, I think I've moved off the claim that a lot of mystics want to make, that like mysticism is the most important thing anyone can ever do in their life. I think some people are interested in mysticism and some people are interested in golf. I'm not interested in golf. It does, and I guess if I was really pressed, I would sort of say on a gut level, like, I think mysticism is better than golf, but I don't have a good reason for that. I think it's a beautiful expression of the human spirit, like poetry and dance and anything else, or any form of art. And I agree, Picasso wasn't such a good guy, right? Does that mean that like Picasso has no value because his art practice didn't make him a better person? Definitely that's not true, right? And some people debate that, right? So what about Wagner, right? So he wasn't just not a nice guy, right? He's also anti-Semitic himself and was then used by even worse anti-Semites and is, so then we could have a debate as to like, well, can you separate Wagner's art from his moral evil? But I'd certainly say for someone less extreme than that, Picasso's maybe a good example, that I wouldn't want to denigrate his art practice because it didn't do this other thing, which he never claimed it would do. I guess there's some mystics really do claim that like once you do this, you're done, and that's where I get a little suspicious.
Wow, this is definitely like a new range of conversation for me, and I'm generally on the other side of this fence of the argument, where I'm saying that the mystic has to be someone who's both experiencing, theorizing, and practicing, and if they're missing any of those three, then there's something failing in their mysticism.
But they might be practicing a different thing, right? I mean, they might be practicing being a hermit and living in a cave and entering what we might call trance states, but which they might call union with God or the divine or something. So practice might still be ethically neutral. I'm not sure. It might be unethical to hide in a cave and just do that, but it's certainly not necessarily. Well, it's ethically positive in that you have a low carbon footprint, but it's not what I think we would consider, tikkun olam in the conventional 20th, 21st century sense. It's not like social justice. It's not helping the world in that way. So practice could look like a lot of different things.
Right. I'm gonna hit you back now with one of your own quotes from 2005.
So far, I'm 0 for 1. So
I feel like one of those.
Who is
people
this
that,
Jay Michaelson guy?
I feel like a political analyst who like pulled up your Twitter and was like saying, like calling out for things you said back in like the 05s. But this is not quite that. And this actually is going to be taking, I think, my side, that there really is an ethical imperative which necessarily follows from mysticism. And this is your quote. You write, "This is what I'm certain of from my mystical experience, that there is a real love that arises. There is only this moment. There is no separate self. And that which we call the world is really only arising in awareness, not my awareness, not yours, but your real awareness." And this was actually in an article that you sent to me in email, so there's a bit more weight to that. The article is called...
Should have read that before I sent it.
Yeah. The article is called, "Does Mysticism Prove the Existence of God?" And I think what you're saying here in this quote, and I mean, it's your quote, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a dissolution of the identification with self, and there is an arisal of love, which is the first thing you say, which I think follows naturally perhaps from that dissolution of self. And in that state of mystical consciousness, which I think may be common, and we'll talk about the commonality of mystical metaphysics in a minute, but which may be common to the metaphysics and psychology of mysticism across the world, there's a natural flowing of love and a natural imperative to treat what we saw previously as the other simply as another manifestation of the all of ourselves, of however it's toned in various traditions, and that will vary, of course. So would you say that there is a sort of necessary imperative of love and non-othering that arises from mysticism?
Yeah, I don't know. Yes. I noticed one thing. This is the easy point, so it's sort of a cop-out to make it first. In our conversation a few minutes ago, there was sort of a mixing of mysticism, whatever that means, with Kabbalah and Kabbalistic speculation. I'm sure you've read Boaz Hus, who's a wonderful academic, who says we shouldn't even think of Kabbalah as mysticism. I think he's probably right, but even if we don't, certainly there's like what we're calling this kind of unitive mystical experience, which looks a little bit like the perennial philosophy and has something to do with, dissolution of the ego on the one hand. And on the other hand, the wonderful, beautiful, complicated, amazing range of Kabbalistic speculations, whether it's combinations of the Sefirot or of the worlds or of whatever, and the symbolism and the textual interpretation that goes with that. So those aren't the same thing, and clearly. And I think it's the latter, all of the fun Kabbalistic stuff, which is what Reb Zalman was calling angel shit. It's like, oh yeah, okay, you've memorized the names of 500 different angels, but what are you really doing in your life? And I think based on knowing people who do a lot of that practice, that I don't know that sense of love and universality arises naturally from those experiences. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Sometimes. But maybe it's what you're going in with. Again, I mean, there's Kabbalists and there's I don't want to pick on like the Jews or the Kabbalists here. There's mystics of every tradition who are extremely particularistic. There's another good Reb Zalman story where there was like a interreligious kind of intermystical dialogue in the 60s, 70s. Art Green was part of it too. And someone was complaining like, oh, Judaism, it's so like ethnocentric and it's got all this garbage and this chosen people and this and that and the other. And Reb Zalman, and it was like, I think it was Muktananda was the Hindu mystic who was there. And Reb Zalman asked him for like the Hindu word for foreigner, which has like a very, also in Japanese and in many other cultures, it's like, not a very nice word, like the word goyim in Hebrew. It's like it has a negative connotation. In some languages, the word for foreigner is just barbarian or monster, right? And his point, Reb Zalman's point in saying that was that's true in every tradition, right? We've just in the 60s we kind of he called it Vedanta for export, Vedanta being the mystical strain within Hinduism. And yeah, it was like Reconstructionist Vedanta. It was like cleansed of all of that sort of stuff that was so particularistic. So I don't want to pick on the Jews or the Kabbalists there, but that kind of practice definitely has a different agenda that's not necessarily the same as this arising of love that comes from mystics. And I would say, putting on my scholar hat, because we're about to switch maybe to the mystic hat, there's always a kind of implicit or explicit picking and choosing that happens in scholarship when we choose which mystical traditions are eligible for our comparative project. So it's like, okay, well, this one, because it had a distinct image of the Virgin Mary and Christ on the cross, that's not the ultimate one, because that was still involved in particularistic blah, blah. No, the ultimate one is when John of the Cross, fully unifies with the all. But that's a theological claim being made by a scholar. That's not in the texts, right? Some texts have those stages, but others don't. For others, the highest possible mystical experience is the vision of Christ on the cross. So even as we do this kind of supposedly scholarly, neutral, and this isn't original to me. Jeffrey Kripal has written. Jeffrey Kripal's already responding to this critique of universalist scholars, right? So we're on the response to the response to the response or something. But the so-called universalists and the perennialists are also choosing. And even within individual texts or experiences, they'll pick and choose. So for example, Abulafia is a really good example. There are moments in Abraham Abulafia, the wonderful ecstatic prophetic Jewish mystic from the 12th and 13th centuries. There are moments of unitive mysticism that are there, but they're encased. I mean, they're just like laminated in very specific stuff about the Hebrew letters, Hebrew alphabet, his Kabbalistic system. And we could extract, and people have, and Aryeh Kaplan did when he popularized Abulafia in the 70s, we could extract what supposedly is the unitive core from the wrapping of Abulafia's Kabbalah. But that's us doing that. Abulafia doesn't see it that way. He doesn't. So it's just, that was a long answer to a question that I've forgotten, but it seemed like something worth saying.
Yeah, I only remember the question because I have them here on a Word document next to your face. But I'm really glad that you went down that path, because that was leading to my next question, which I wanted to ask you about. And I knew
that because I have psychic powers from Kabbalah.
I know that you're just looking off the reflection of my glasses and reading
No. Actually, my psychic powers come from the fourth jhana in Buddhism. That's where they come from. Just kidding. There's no psychic. No, I don't have any psychic powers.
I think you do, because
But if I did, they would come from multiple sources.
the next line literally reads that you're a meditation teacher of jhana meditation, and that was the next thing I was going to ask you about. So I'm actually do think you have those powers, and they're from jhana. I want to. This is going to be very audacious. And out of place for me, because I have nowhere near the credentials or scholarship that you have in the field of scholarly mysticism. But I would like to, with your permission, disagree with you and give an alternative spin. I mean, like two Jews sitting down for a Zoom conversation, we still have to disagree. So I was very turned on by the perennialists when I got started onto my foray into universalistic mysticism.
As was I.
Yeah. As I think many of us probably were, by William James and Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts and that whole group and others, Evelyn Underhill even. And then as I continued to read, being a critical and thinking person, I didn't just want to get that story, and I realized that there was also like the Stephen Katz and the constructivists and the contextualists, and I really did try to challenge the perennialistic beliefs. And there's been, as you said, already responses to the response and responses to that response. And we don't have to go through the whole genealogy of the scholarship because that will be boring for the audience. But just to get to the point, I think that I knew that you take this position because I heard you talk about this in an interview with Robert Wright on The Wright Show when you were talking about your book, Enlightenment by Trial and Error, where you say that the notion that mysticism fundamentally is about unity and unitive experience and unitive practice is mistaken, because there are legitimate forms of mysticism, as you mentioned, the Merkava and Heichalat mysticism of Judaism, which are non-unitive, which are about sort of encountering these divine or angelic beings, but not uniting with them. And I want to venture to suggest, and I think that this suggestion is not just me trying to, it could be, but I think it's not me trying to slip the perennialists back into the sort of scholarly and critical thought of mysticism, but I think it's something which is evident within the mystics writing themselves. And I can give examples if that comes up, where the same way that the mystics differentiate between the esoteric and the exoteric within religion, between the nigla and nistar, between batin and zahir in various traditions, within the mystical traditions themselves, there's as well a level of exotericism and esotericism. As you so eloquently put it, Reb Zalman called the angel shit, which is the exoteric packaging, and within Jewish mysticism, which is the tradition that I know best, there's and which you know very well, of course, there's many like levels and layers and realities and sfirot and like phases of reality. You have your Atzilos and your Bria and your Tzir and your Keser and Atik and Arch. But the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters following the Kabbalists, when they're like sort of reaching like a peak moment or like a truth moment, or they're on their deathbed, they seem to say that all of that is like meaningless. And they're like, I belong to the Chabad tradition, and the Alter Rebbe says this very clearly, and he's a bona fide mystic as far as I can tell, that I don't want all of your angels, I don't want all of your levels, I don't want all of the heavens, I just want you alone. And it's the same trend within Sufism, where I think it's Abu Yazid who's like offered all of these states of glory and ecstasy, and all he wants is God alone. And it's a very, very similar process where the mystic is intent on rejecting even the exotericism of the esoteric. I think Meister Eckhart is a great example, where he says he doesn't even want, he's like beyond Jesus, he's beyond God, he just wants to be like at the grounded being itself, where there's sort of no more names, no more labels. And I think that is necessarily unitive, or perhaps in more Eastern language, non-dualistic. What would you say about that argument? And the case therefore is that mysticism really at its core, and I know these are such like difficult words to use in a scholarly context, is really still unitive. And all the non-unitive stuff is kind of what the mystic really wants to leave behind in their own admission.
Yeah, which mystic, right? I mean, you've chosen the Alter Rebbe, like the best, example in the Jewish tradition of the point you want to make. But you could pick any number of other Hasidic masters, let alone other Kabbalists. You could pick Rabbi Nachman, who has some unitive aspects, sort of, but really his spirituality is different. It's a clearly mystical spirituality. I don't think, again, maybe we shouldn't use the word mystical. Maybe Boaz Hus is right, and this whole word is just not helpful, because baked in. Hus's point is that, I think, is that baked into the word mysticism are a number of our unitive assumptions that this is what counts, and are also Christian assumptions about what mysticism is supposed to be and look like, and what the path is supposed to look like. And it's a fine term to use internally for Christian mystical traditions, but it shouldn't be used in the way that we're using it in this conversation, and in the way you are in your entire YouTube series. So maybe have Boaz come on the thing. He'd be a great guest, actually, and he's funny too. So yeah, I mean, I think you're making his point in a certain way, right? So yes, I agree with your take on the Alter Rebbe. You know, I meant when I went to get my PhD originally, I was going to write on Rav Aharon, his foremost disciple, not the person who carried on the lineage, but who was even more non-dualistic and even more unitive, and says exactly that the world before creation, which is all God, is exactly the same as the world after creation. He's really one of the only Jewish figures who will even say, like, this is all illusion. And I was totally entranced by that. And in fact, the first book written about him in English language was called Seeker of Unity, so maybe resonates. But we could find other mystics. Rabbi Nachman's a good example, but we could think of many more who don't have that. Is it an ontological priority, or it's a sort of practical priority, I guess? Maybe it's ontological, that like these other things are on this level, but ultimately it's that. You know, and I came under a little bit of fire for doing the same thing with the Zohar. There are passages in the Zohar which say over and over kula chada, kula chada. There are a number of passages which are unitively focused in the Zohar, but I think I'm persuaded, and for me, I think Malila Helnar Eshed's work on the Zohar is maybe the most persuasive, that to kind of fit the Zohar into that box is maybe to flatten the Zohar a little bit. And actually, it's much richer if we keep this non-unitive but fantastically interesting. And I remember just a handful of times, there's like a Zohar circle that used to meet in Jerusalem that I was part of, a mix of sort of Westerners and Israelis and religious and less conventionally religious. And, you know, we would really go there and like take, you know, hours and trade back and forth, like in a jazz improv session. And, you know, you would do this and I would play that. And you get into this mind state where like the symbols are more real than the manifestation. And you start to, anytime you see anything blue around, you know, it's like there's Malchut. And like it just becomes so automatic that you really inhabit that symbolic universe. And it does really seem like you're on that level. Is that unitive? I don't even know what's so great about unitive. I mean, it's if you're enmeshed, if the ego is sort of less operative and you're enmeshed in this symbolic matrix, that's pretty awesome. I don't even know if I care whether it's unitive or not. I don't think it is, according to what we think of as unitive. It seems different. It's also connected to sacred text and to Torah in a way that's sort of mythic in a hard sense, meaning, no, it really is the Torah. Like it couldn't be the Bhagavad Gita. Like it's the Torah. Like that's the basis. So it has that commitment, which again, a perennialist probably wouldn't like that, nor would a universalist. So I think I'll keep pushing back, you know. And again, I'm blessed to have had experiences that have felt really unitive, and also ones that haven't. You know, I don't talk about my ayahuasca experiences in writing, but I do on podcasts and YouTubes. And you know, these are not necessarily unitive experiences; these are visionary experiences, and that's different. And I think it's okay. I don't think it's like, I don't know that why there's this sense that like it's like a kashrut test, like it's only kosher if it's unitive. There's a lot of experiences that are profound, and maybe this is a good segue to the jhana conversation, that I don't even know, you know, if unitive is even an operative term, if there's not like a sort of deity out there who's being unified with. Is there a sense, to me, actually, the Hasidic notion of dveikut, which maybe means clinging or closeness or proximity, or sometimes could mean melting into, it could be unitively defined if you really wanted to. But to me, it's just like the presence of the numinous. That's like good enough. I don't know if it has to be like total ego death for me to feel like, oh, that was really that was time well spent.
Yeah, I definitely hear you, and it's definitely fascinating for multiple reasons. Firstly, because I have a strong feeling that Zohar circle that you went to is one which I've also sat on a few times, and
I'm sure it is.
Yeah. So that's quite funny, but I think I I'm quite convinced, and I have some points of rebuttal, which I'm not sure like if we're going to continue going back and forth on this point, because it may become a bit too.
But what's at stake for you? Like, so what if it's like, let's say you're wrong and I'm right. Like, have you lost anything?
I'm happy to be wrong. I'm really.
No, yeah, but I mean, like, what's at stake? Like, let's say, I mean, like, what does it matter in a certain way if there is one core unitive mystical experience that's everywhere, or if there's not? I mean, I guess if we're trying to because where I'm going with this is, if we're trying to make mysticism prove something, then maybe that's pretty important, right? And again, one of the recent guests, like last week or something, was like, this is like the central question, is mysticism telling us the truth about reality or not? I used to feel that. I definitely felt that for 20 years. I felt that was like the central question, and I'm not sure I do anymore, because I just don't think we ever get out of the sort of, at a certain point, like, the materialist reductivist explanation is pretty solid. The non-materialist, non-reductivist explanation is pretty solid. And I almost don't, it's like, are we trying to prove that there's a reality to this God thing? Is that what's really at stake? Or are we trying to prove that, like, are we progressively minded or egalitarianly minded? And so we're trying to prove that all religions are valid and we should stop hating other people. That would be a nice thing to prove. But, like, I'm not sure that looking at mysticism closely can get you there. And so that's why I mean by what's at stake. Like, is my own experience at stake? Like, so I have a profound experience that I think is mystical in a sort of true way. This is like the noetic quality of mystic. Like, no, I'm knowing something that's true. I'm not just having an experience. I'm actually knowing something that's true about the universe, whatever that means. So maybe that's what's at stake. Maybe it's like the value of my own experience. But that's, I guess, again, why I kind of fall back to that boring, pragmatic, utilitarian, what a dirty word to use, approach, where it's like, okay, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, but, like, how does it lead to, is it less dear to me? Because, I mean, I guess it would be more dear, more precious, if I knew that was like definitely the establishable truth of reality. And for me, that's more true for psychedelic experiences. Like, so, in the last few years working with the toad medicine, 5-MeO-DMT, those are pretty incredible mystical experiences with full ego death, it's like the textbook, exactly what all of these texts have been saying. And you have it, and it's incredible, and it's sometimes hard, and it's amazing. And it's like, I guess I would really love to believe that is a truthful look at the ultimate nature of reality. That is definitely how it feels in the experience. In the experience, there is zero doubt whatsoever that this is reality, that experience is reality. Everything else is just like the ripples on the ocean, just like that Jay Michaelson guy wrote in the book. And the ocean is real, and nothing. And I guess but then, having had that experience many times, I've had the come down every time also. Sometimes it takes a few weeks, a months, hours, where it's like back to conventional dualistic reality. And so I guess I've arrived at this place of, I don't want to, it sounds a little like a cop-out to just say I don't know, but I guess that's where I've kind of landed. It's not that I know that those experiences are not noetic, right? But I guess I just don't want to make them carry any water. Like, I don't want anything to be at stake. Sorry, I went on too long on that one.
No, not at all. No. So I think you're actually pushing. Firstly, I love this. I love the fact that, like, this is like a live organic conversation, and, like, as much as we can pre-plan it, like, it's just going to be like whatever comes up, and there's something really engaging and exciting and fun and dynamic about that. So, like, feel free to go on and to, like, this is cool. Like, this is what I love, and this is why I do this. I think that you're pushing against legitimate things. Like, you're pushing back against legitimate things that could be concerns. And I think a lot of the perennialist agenda did have those agendas there. They were trying to prove something. I think in my case, what I'm looking for is none of those things. And my thinking is kind of trying to apply unitive thinking across philosophy. I'm very interested in, like, philosophical mysticism, where mysticism and philosophy interact. So I like to apply this sort of unitive or non-dualistic, and I know those terms are different, thinking not just in terms of experience, but also in terms of my ontology and epistemology. So, and I think this is something which comes from the mystics themselves and from the philosophically inclined mystics and mystically inclined philosophers, where the difference between a subjective and an objective experience relies upon an ontological difference between subject and object, spirit and matter, mind and body. And for the mystic, those things are collapsed. To use Spinoza as an example, they would propose something instead like a dual aspect theory. And there's obviously going to be very many different formulations of this, but I think that's something that really does run true. And as perennialist as this sounds, I think between someone like Nagarjuna and, Advaita Vedanta and what's going to come out of the Sufis and the Christians and like all the traditions, there's a real case to be made against the inherent dualizing that we create. And therefore, the point is not to be proving anything objectively, because there is no difference between the objective and the subjective. And instead, what mysticism can contribute is simply a state of being that is in accordance with the way of reality is, as part of reality, and not other and separate from it. So I'm really not trying to slip in the ghost in the machine or the God in the figure. I think mysticism does more to dismantle classic theistic notions of God than it does to buttress it, much to the dismay of many religionists. So that's maybe where my thinking is riding.
Yeah, I like that. It's sort of a nice coincidence that, since it would be helpful if we didn't dualize all the time, self and other, in group, out group, etc. Here's this experience which is the opposite of dualizing, which we can have. And so it's sort of a fortunate coincidence. Yeah, I guess I still, the part about the no difference between subjective and objective, I feel like we always hear these things from our contemporary moment, whatever that is, and right now, obviously people will be listening to this when the pandemic is in the rear view mirror, which is great. And here's this little time capsule of how crappy it was in 2020 and 21. I have a lot of value in objective reasoning and in scientific reasoning, and we're facing a lot of challenges with people who don't share that value. Not to say that to say subjective and objective are the same as to be anti-science, but it can easily slide into that direction. And we've seen that in the sort of left-wing conspiracy world, in the New Age conspirituality world, where precisely that move happens. Where it's like, I'm used to trusting my subjective experience. There's no difference between subjective and objective. Therefore, there's no really objective thing, and it leads to some pretty bad results. So there's a little trigger that happens for me just around that piece. But that is in there, right? I mean, as soon as you sort of like start to question if you really take Atman as Brahman that seriously, I don't know, why can't you heal yourself from disease with positive thoughts, right? I mean, it's hard to sort of say, I can say why not, but it's kind of hard to say that on a sort of, if you're really living that life all the time. And that's even true in a more moderate sense. If you're just having, good old-fashioned ontological skepticism of dualism like you're proposing, healthy skepticism of dualistic materialism, that's great. But then if we take that same healthy skepticism and apply it to some of the, to climate science, let's say, since that'll be more relevant to listeners next year, perhaps, that leads us to a lot of problems. So and it feels also to me like mysticism feels like a lot of work to just get to that. I maybe would just rather have some good pedagogy where we just try to teach people not to take their categories and assumptions so seriously and so heavily. And
yeah, that's definitely fascinating, and I'm definitely with you in the concern of the skepticism towards science. And I think that I'm a fan of Bruno Latour, who speaks a lot about how science taught us to be skeptical, but now it's been taken a bit too far, and people are being skeptical of the things.
Yeah, which is funny. I mean, I know you've had folks from the Western esotericist world, and they would be horrified at the skepticism of science. Like they thought they were doing science, right? The whole esoteric tradition really valued that kind of reason of what they saw as scientific reasoning. And our science has changed maybe, but the value on what we would now see as the scientific method was there. So I that's some of the pushback on that. But ultimately, again, I don't think if what's at stake is we should really be less dualistic toward each other and we should be nicer towards each other, I don't think we have to worry. I think even if mysticism turns out to be complete delusion, there are other good reasons to have skepticism of dualistic thinking in the world.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying, and I think two things are coming to mind. One is that I think that there's a place to advocate. I think that there may have been a bit of an older scientific worldview which really was like hard baked into a mind-body dualism. And I think what's perhaps emerging more in today's science, although I'm no scientist, is more of a participatory view where it's human observation. And I'm not going down the quantum physics, quantum mysticism.
Sounded like you were.
I'm not. I'm going more down like the Alfred North Whitehead view, where there's a real process and an interaction where we are part of the ecosystems. We're not separate things that are alien to the environments and ecosystems that we're in, but we're part of those, and what we do affects those realities. And not so much that it's wishful thinking or magical thinking, but that there is a real power in the way that we set our minds and our intentions, and we can, like, the fact is that even from like a scientific perspective, and I know saying that is not the way to introduce something scientific, is that if someone in their mind is like has no will to live, let's say for example, you can give them a tremendous amount of medicine, it's not going to save them. Like, medicine has to be working with someone's will to live, and if someone wants to overcome something, they can overcome the most insane diseases because the mind really does there is a real participation between what we see as two separate things between the mind and body, which perhaps they're really not. And I'm not saying this at all to be skeptical of the sciences. I'm saying this to promote, I think, what is a new vision of science, which is more unitive and participatory. But maybe we're getting off track now. I can't tell.
I feel like the reason I've come back to boring Dharma as opposed to the fun stuff, like the mystical stuff, is that it just feels like the solutions to these problems are much more boring, right? Are like, again, basic Buddha Dharma, like greed, hatred, and delusion is present. How can I have a little less of that? You know, I used to get angry 10 times a week. Now I only get angry 3 times a week. That sounds like a good idea. You know, these kind of, and one of, you know, where I'm not a professional academic anymore, right? Or at all. And, you know, I'm trying to like teach meditation to as many people as possible, you know, but through a meditation app, you know, that I work for. And that just feels closer to like evidence-based improvement in the human condition. You know, like how do we get ourselves out of this mess that we're in? There are a lot of things that are necessary. One of them seems to be like maybe working on the human mind in a way that could open it somewhat. Jury's still out as to whether that's going to work, and it maybe won't, but that's why I kind of come back to this from the more theoretical piece to just like boring. And I'm calling it boring because it doesn't involve any of the fun stuff that we've been talking about. It's just like, you could be a full-on materialist, reductivist, dualist, boring Western science person, and still do like your basic mindfulness stuff and have a lot of those kind of benefits and shifts in traits happen. And that's why it's boring, and it doesn't belong on your show. But it's where I end up because it's kind of like, okay, that seems to make a difference.
I'm curious, do you see that as other than mysticism? Because as far as I'm aware of like basic, you know, Dharma teaching and basic principles of Buddhism, part of the right mindfulness, which is the way in which we alleviate suffering, is not clinging onto false conceptions of self, which are othering conceptions. So maybe we're not talking about two different things here.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that has to do with Buddhist modernism and the import of the sort of export of mindfulness, and then the re-importing of mindfulness to the West, where, yes, non-self remains part of Western Buddhism. It only shows, and we're playing with it where I work and in finding ways to communicate that in sort of more secular mindfulness contexts. Secular itself is sort of a word that doesn't make any sense, but we'll put that on the shelf for the moment. But I do think there's a difference in emphasis. Yeah, I mean, it's there, and I can go into detail into where it is, but it's there. But it doesn't get emphasized in the sort of hard ontological sense as much partly because it's just sort of hard to get without intensive practice. So you can talk about it, but to actually have that experience, you can have it a little bit just in ordinary meditation, but I think it takes the mind a little while to get more concentrated and more refined to really see the selfing arise and thus have it not arise. And so it just gets a little less play than the usual stuff. Notice the clinging, see if you can let go a little bit more, like that kind of more mundane stuff. So you're right. Ultimately, there's that substrate that's there. But then again, that mystical substrate is present in various religions too, and it's not necessarily what's emphasized.
Yeah. I feel like we've reached a bit of a middle ground there, and I want to jump onto the next segment here, which is actually about meditation, and then from there, hopefully, we'll move into Judaism and Buddhism, because you have some actually very fascinating insights about the relationship between those two traditions, which when I read them, they were a real eye-opener. And we can talk about that in a second. When it comes to meditation, you are according to what I read on your own website, I believe it was, you are a meditation, or it was on Wikipedia, so either one of the two. You are a meditation teacher in the Jhana tradition of the Theravada Buddhist lineage of, and I may be mispronouncing this last part, Ayakema.
Mm-hmm. Yep. One of the original BuJus.
Oh, very cool.
She has an amazing story, Holocaust survivor turned Sri Lankan nun. Yeah, amazing story, amazing human being.
And I want to springboard you with one of your quotes from 2014. And I'd love to hear about what you do as a teacher within that lineage and what that means and how that connects to the tradition and all that fun stuff. You wrote, meditation and yoga have been clearly established to improve immune responses, decrease levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, decrease reactivity, i.e. lashing out, sending bad emails, saying stupid things, and heal serious conditions like PTSD and depression. So there's good scientific evidence to show the positive benefits of silence, of meditation. I'm curious to know, is that the full picture of what you try to achieve with your meditation? And if that is, that's great. I'm not trying to denigrate that. What are you trying to get at in your tradition, in your meditation, and what are you bringing from the Jhana Theravada tradition?
So yeah, there's kind of a distinction between what my own personal practice might look like and what its agenda is and what I do for my job. That is kind of, that is where we want to end up in a sort of introductory mindfulness, secular Western mindfulness kind of context. And that's why it's boring, right? It's like, stress reduction. But, that's where people are suffering, right? And again, we're speaking in early 2021. We've seen that in the last year. I mean, it's been profoundly moving to be able to offer tools for people to endure such a challenging time. And there's a lot of dukkha, of suffering out there right now, to put it mildly. So it's felt really good to do the boring stuff because that's where the suffering is. Now, I mean, would mysticism or mystical practice also do that? Maybe, but it's also less accessible. It's a lot harder. It depends on a lot more stuff. It brings up a lot of doubt for a lot of people. And so whereas here are these tools which, I'm always hesitant to jump from 21st century mindfulness to something the Buddha said in a text, which mindfulness teachers do all the time. I'm just hesitant to do it. But the Buddha did say, he's explicitly sort of rejected a lot of the mystical trends of his time and a lot of the cosmological questions. Was the world created? Was the world eternal? What happened? How karma? And he said, I just don't really care about that. I care about suffering and the end of suffering. Now, it so happens that the end of suffering on an enlightenment level does involve what we might call mystical insights. Certainly, non-self is one of those. But he explicitly rejected the emphasis, certainly on deity, mysticism and deity practice, on rites and rituals as a way of bringing liberation. So, again, not that it's like, the Buddha said it, therefore whatever, but this one particular teacher, for whatever his value is, did sort of explicitly de-emphasize, not really reject, because he didn't say it was wrong, but he just de-emphasized that. historically, I could spend a long time talking about jhana, about how it kind of got squidged into the Buddhist tradition. And long story short, there were multiple iterations in the first few hundred years after the Buddha's death of like, well, what was the essential teaching? And it grew up in a social context and a cultural context. And if you didn't have these sort of attainments and these kind of profound mystical states, who were you? You were sort of like a loser. So it got re-emphasized, and we'll never really, I don't think we'll ever really know what the historical Buddha thought of it, because it's all mediated through these texts and traditions. For myself, I was really pulled in two different directions. I was able, in 2007, it was at the end of a relationship, and there was also a career juncture, and I was able to like ask myself, there's a quote by Baudrillard that I have somewhere on back here, once you are free, you're forced to ask who you are, or what you want to do. Like, who am I? What is it that I want if I have that freedom? And I had that freedom at that time. It's funny, I don't have that freedom at all now, but I did then. And, I wanted to get enlightened. Like, I wanted liberation. That's what I wanted. And there were these two different directions within the Theravadan Buddhist path, one of which was like really going through what's called the progress of insight and seeing suffering over and over again in different forms. And eventually the mind learns to let go. And the other were the jhanas. They work together in the following way. Like, the jhanas are simply concentrated mind states. So you get super concentrated, you do a lot of meditation for a lot of hours, it takes a while. And the mind eventually gets so clear that it's much easier to do the work of insight. So, you're sitting in meditation and you just notice the slightest movement of mind or heart, and you just become the mind just becomes very malleable, which is one of the words that's used in the texts. It's also true that those states in and of themselves are filled with joy and beauty and love. And I was just entranced by those because I've always been into mystical states, like we said a long time ago in this conversation. And so I went for it. It just felt like, and in a funny way, jhana was both the culmination and the refutation of a lot of earlier mystical practice, because these are states which, at least in the container, or in the context, I should say, in the context that they're practiced, are just mind states. Like, they're not seen as mystical states. In certain contemporary, they weren't called Hindu yet, but what would be later called Hindu traditions, contemporary with the Buddha, they were seen that way. They were heavenly realms that you could enter and experience. And I can definitely see, having had those experiences, why you would describe them that way, because that is the sort of phenomenological experience of them. But these four basic mind states, and jhana, incidentally, is just the word. It's the same word as for meditation. That's like leads to chan in Chinese and zen in Japanese. It's not like a magic word. It just means get concentrated, do this concentration meditation, and the mind gets so kind of focused and quiet and clear that all of these phenomena arise. And it's pretty amazing. And really some of the most profound experiences of my life. I did a 2-month retreat just focused on jhana with this Burmese meditation master, and who's kind of the living embodiment of Yoda, basically, this amazing sage with all this wisdom. And I'm really glad I did those things. Part of it was this kind of letting go of the states having to be more than the states. But they're so profound and so transformative. I've written about them. It's easy to find my writing about them online. Others have as well. The tragedy of the states is that they are hard to get to. I can't get to them in daily life, certainly not now, but even when my daily life was less noisy. You really need to go on retreat. They're not, and when meditation teachers in Burma and in India about 140, 150 years ago kind of thought about ways to synthesize their practice for lay people instead of just monks and nuns, they filtered this out because this is too hard to do. And you can see why they did that. Nevertheless, it's I wish everybody could go on a jhana retreat because it's so beautiful and powerful.
Wow, that's really wild. I had no idea of like the amount of, I mean, obviously it's there, but the sort of complexity within the tradition and the variations of that, and it's so cool that you found that, like, that one specific form that is really like turns you on. And I would love to bring you in back to sort of lead some form of meditation like that. We're reaching the end of our hour here, and I want to do a lightning round. And I'm just going to throw out the rest of the topics that we had lined up.
You can always just have me back another time. This is fun for me. So
let's at least get a taste of these things, because I know it's always hard to get someone back than when they're here ready, but we'll try and move through them quickly. Buddhism and Judaism, I always thought about them as very metaphysically, theologically, ontologically, totally others. At the head of Buddhism is shunyata, is an emptiness, is nothingness. The Buddha, as you said, has no claim to the existence of God, and Judaism has a very serious monotheism. And yet, in one of your articles, you write that perhaps dichotomy may not be as true as it is. Could you enlighten us on why the metaphysics of Judaism and Buddhism may not be so different?
Well, one of my first Jewish teachers, Rabbi Michael Paley, said to be a good Jew, you have to believe in one God or fewer. That seems right to me. I know, obviously, for a lot of Jewish folks, God is absolutely central, experientially, not just theoretically. But for others, it's not really. Like, that concept just doesn't play in as much. And that's true for many religious Jews as well. It's like you're doing the commandments, you're studying, you're doing your thing. And so I'm not sure it's like that central, but I think they also sort of answer different questions. What I said a minute ago, the Buddha didn't reject the various theistic practices that were there. And there's plenty of supernatural stuff in the first Buddhist texts, what's known as the Pali Canon. The Pali is the language before Sanskrit that they were written in. There's all kinds of supernatural stuff happening, talking to deities, divine beings, and talking to spirits and all of these kinds of stuff. So the notion that there's this so there are some teachers who want to say, well, that was just added later. That wasn't the Buddha's real teaching. Maybe, but it's certainly in the text. So that's there, but there's not like a setting aside of the concept, any of the supernaturalism that's possible. And certainly in later schools of Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism and in Vajrayana, in particular Vajrayana, which has these very mystical seeming concepts around awareness, which you referenced a little bit earlier in a quote from me. There it seems like they're talking about the same stuff. I mean, Rigpa in Tibetan Buddhism compared with Ein Sof, it's like very, very similar. And so it actually there gets even aligned on that kind of theological sense, if you want to say that. But I think they just are answering in my life, they're answering different questions, and they work really well together. My Jewish ritual practice is enriched by doing simple mindfulness, just getting quiet before lighting those candles. My Jewish ethical practice is greatly strengthened by having mindfulness as an ally. I'm still a jerk a lot of the time, as my partner can tell you, but maybe less of the time than before. And the tools that enable Judaism does a nice job for me of setting out some ideals about ethical behavior, but it's the Buddha Dharma that gives me the how to do that. I know Musar does that for other people. There are a lot of various ways to do that, but for me, it's the Dharma. So at some point, maybe I'll just write a book just on BuJu to make that more clear. But for somehow, I guess because of all the other contradictions in my life, this one doesn't seem that anomalous.
That's fantastic. That's I want to end with one final question, and thank you so much for joining us. It's
only 2 questions in the lightning round. That was like a little lightning.
I don't know how much I can pack into the lightning round. I'm trying to.
My long answers, I just have to be more like thunderous in my answers. No.
I have to. What's that? There's a game they play which is underrated, overrated, and like it's basically a one-word answer. God, underrated, overrated.
Overrated.
Okay.
The fake God is overrated. The real God is underrated.
Nice, that's a good answer. I'm trying to kind of smush a couple of the final questions here into one question. You wrote a fantastic article on Post-Monism and theological polymorphism in the Zohar and Jewish mysticism.
Well, you and your viewers are the 8 people on the planet who will love that article. So I'm very happy to talk about it.
Hello, that is why the internet is incredible, right? Because we can create this very niche community where we can.
No one has ever called that article, what did you say, fantastic or whatever, until this moment. But I think it's one of my best pieces.
Yeah, no, it really is. It really is. And like when I'm reading generally about interviewing someone, I'm reading just to know about what to be asking them, and sometimes I'm actually adding to my own research, and that's one which I'm definitely adding to my own library and taking notes from. So thank you.
The worst presentation of my life, I presented that at the Science and Non-Duality conference, and it was just I thought it was great, and at the end, it was clear that no one else thought that.
No, so I think it's great, and let's try bringing.
And that video's online.
Oh, I'm gonna check it out. You bet I'm gonna. No, because it's a really great article, and I think the core point there, although there's a couple points, is a really fantastic one, and I'm gonna phrase it in kind of, I'm gonna phrase a question from like from a very ignorant perspective, and sort of set you up for the home run, hopefully here. So the ignorant question is, Dr. Michaelson, Jay, isn't mysticism all escapism and just getting away from the world and escaping the beauty of diversity and multiplicity and all the things that we can find in this world and all the sensuous experience? Isn't mysticism just, a bit trying to run away into what's Hegel's term, the night where all cows are black? Why would that's a layman's expression. Why would someone want to do that with their lives when life is so beautiful?
That's funny, because I don't know if that's the same question as related to that paper, but I'm certainly happy to answer it. I'll answer it in three ways that I know of. The one that's the most on point for what I think you're asking about is there's a Hasidic story that which was probably, there's a Hasidic story where there's a king wants to learn like wisdom, basically. And he meets this wise person, basically teaches him that everything, all of these different delights of the world, cake and bread, and it's all food because it's a Jewish story. All of these things are actually just wheat. Right? They're just made of wheat. And so if you really want to know the essence of every food, of all these foods, it's also a Jewish story because it's all carbs. You should just know wheat. And the king's like, you're right. What am I wasting time with all of these various pastries and confections? I should just eat wheat. And the story concludes like, and so the king deprived himself of all of the delights of the world. A very good Jewish story about essence is essence, but manifestation also has value. So that's the story. Well, it is a very Zoharic story, right? Because part of the Zohar's question is like, what is the value of this worldly if everything is ultimately Ein Sof? Or how do we have a world in which, right? And so emanation is one of the answers to that, Sefirot are one of the answers to that, but it's that tendency to push against everything is God, I'm done, right? Well, that's to miss out on the whole world. And it's also to miss out on ethical life, right? On trying to help people suffer less. And it misses out on all the hedonistic delights of the world. And yeah, that's really the answer to that question. You framed it almost maybe a little too populistically, whereas there is this image like that the mystic just sort of leaves and just sits on the mountaintop. And I thought about that myself when I was a kid. I saw the movie Dead Poets Society when it came out. I was like 17, and Seize the Day became my operative, maxim for around 10 years or so. And actually, even now, when I look back, there are things I would do differently, but in my life. But I definitely did well on Seize the Day. I definitely seized a lot of days. I feel very good about that. Now I'm in a different phase of life. The world is also in a different place, but I can feel good about having spent a good 20 years seizing the day. And it occurred to me on one of these silent meditation retreats when they're doing nothing and, staring at the wall all the time and just walking back and forth in a Buddhist retreat. And it's like, how did seizing the day ever end up to this? Part of it was to have those amazing states that I talked about, the mind states you just get a little bit concentrated and you go out and you see a single flower and you're certainly convinced that the world is drenched in God and you're having an experience of it. In the experience, there's none of the doubt that we talked about a few minutes ago at all. It's an absolutely certain, much more certain than this experience, this moment. It's a certainty. Later, there's doubt. Part of it's that. Part of it is also just even in the mundane, right? If I want to seize the day, the metaphor I use over and over again in my teaching is like that life is like a radio, and you can turn up the volume to hear the music or turn down the static to hear the music. So turning up the volume means going to Burning Man 14 times, which I've done, and having amazing, intense experiences. And that's great, including mystical experiences. But then there is the turning down the volume, or turning down the static approach. And that, for me, is where meditation comes in. That, as Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said, the world is full of light and mysteries, but our little hand blocks us from seeing sometimes. So it's to see that can happen, and to open the mind and heart more, so that having just another sandwich can be a beautiful experience, not just in like some literary or poet, but actually doing eating meditation with a sandwich, or when I teach eating meditation, we use a single raisin, and having that experience. So contemplative practice, maybe not mystical, but contemplative practice for me, in the way that I do it and a lot of other people do it, does lead to more appreciation of those experiences. And they're not just sensual ones. There's also ethical and relational, being open to love more and being open to relationship more. And so ultimately for me, the contemplative practice leads to much more appreciation of the pastries, not just the wheat.
And is there a sense that it's an appreciation of something divine or sacred in the mundane?
That would have been how I would put it at some points in the past. Did you read my essay called Fresh Baked Bread? You read that one. These days, I'm much more into... So the bread, bread can have a lot of... We just talked about bread and that mystical metaphor. It also has Jewish legal significance and the blessing you make over it. And does this count as a meal? And how much bread? And what? And if it's a Friday night, it might be challah bread, and then that's special bread. There's also just the experience just of fresh baked bread, and just of the being present to that with whatever cosmology. So maybe it's not sacred or divine, but it's the bread, and fresh baked bread is so good and so nourishing, and you can have just the pleasure of it, and also the experience of of gratitude that arises, right? You'll eat and be satisfied, and you'll just spontaneously want to give thanks, to bless. You can, just having that bread and being aware that others don't have it, and knowing not only that people aren't having the pleasure of fresh baked bread, but even the sustenance of bread, so can lead us to hopefully lead maybe a little bit more of an ethical life, where we care more, where the heart breaks more.
Yeah.
So I think it's great for folks who are wired to perceive the sacred and the divine in the bread. That is great. Keep doing that. But I think it can also be experienced in a way without those particular attributions that is equally holy.
Yeah. I totally feel that. And on that beautiful note, I want to say that as much as someone can and should be enjoying their fresh baked bread, and that we can definitely agree on, consensus, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation for all of its naturalness and freshness and warmth and humanness and humor and wit. And thank you so much for joining me and for participating in this experience. I hope I was not too cantankerous and argumentative.
There's no way you could have been more cantankerous than me, so I feel great. No, I'm really happy. I hope that folks watching this feel a sense of community with the other people watching this, because I think it's a small percentage of the world who happen to be wired this way, who happen to be interested in these questions, but they're really lovely questions.
Yes,
and I'm definitely in that weird group of weirdos. So I hope that folks can feel that connection with you and with the other people who you're talking to, because it's lovely to be part of this hidden academy. That's a word from the UFO world, that there's this hidden academy of people who are interested in this. And I'm glad you're one of the deans.
Oh, that's really sweet. It's been absolutely lovely to have you here as a guest lecturer in the Hidden Academy, let's say, and
adjunct.
An adjunct, that's right. The pay is not high, but the emotional and social payoff maybe is a bit better. And we that's spot on. We really do. We hope to create community here on this in this very niche topic. So thank you so much for joining us, Jay, Dr. Michaelson. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope to stay in touch. And thank you.
Thank you.